So I'm delighted to be able to introduce my political science colleague, Sarah Daly, who's the author of the book that we're going to talk about today, Violent Victors, Bloodstained Parties Winning Post-War Elections, kind of big puzzle of why voters reward the worst perpetrators of violence during the Civil War so often. I'm just going to read you a few blurbs from the back of the book. An impressive book in its breadth and comprehensive approach, a tour de force, compelling in this masterful book, etc., etc. So this comes from, a whole raft of prominent scholars, including Barbara Walter, not only a scholar, but a best-selling author. So this has already got the stamp of approval. Am I allowed to say about the Lubbert? You're in the Final Four, or is it the Sweet 16? The Greg Lubbert Prize for. So the Lubbert Prize is for the best book in comparative politics overall. Woo-hoo. So, but you're an IR person, yeah. So if you win the best book in comparative politics,
yes,
that'll
that
be
just showed we rock.
IR hegemony, and this will be like the year of humiliation. But we hope you'll win anyhow. Sarah has won lots of wonderful awards and accolades. She was the envy of everyone for being chosen as a Carnegie Corporation Scholar, which was one of the benefits that got us this book finished in timely fashion. So, Sarah, please, without further ado, please tell us the answer to this puzzling fact of why people vote for perpetrators of atrocity.
Well, thank you so much to the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies and the Institute for Latin American Studies, Institute for Human Rights might have wanted to the Department of Political Science for hosting this event, and a huge thank you to Jack for moderating. Jack has been given me invaluable feedback at every single stage of this book's construction, and his mark is on the pages of this book. And so if you wish to praise it, you can thank him, and if you wish to criticize it, then you can blame him.
These people didn't mention me.
And thank you all for coming, especially given that it is the most beautiful day outside. So the book studies elections after Civil War and seeks to understand why so many people support parties that committed mass atrocities against the civilian population during wartime. And the seed for the project was planted in a course at Stanford University, where it was a course on the politics of human rights. And we learned about the Pinochet coup and the repressive dictatorship that left over 40,000 victims in its wake. And shortly thereafter, I went to live in Chile, and I lived with a family that was very much pro-Pinochet, joining the ranks of approximately 45% of the population that supported Pinochet even after the transition to democracy. I was struck by this. I was struck again while I was researching my first book on why half of peace agreements fail while half succeed. And for this book, I spent 18 months in Colombia interviewing hundreds of rebels and paramilitaries and their victims. And the former fighters and their victims told me about the indiscriminate massacres, kidnappings, and rapes and torture that the fighters, the armed groups, had carried out. And yet I found that in many places, the populations supported the former fighters and their allied politicians, even after they had handed over their weapons and demobilized. And I found that these patterns exhibit themselves very broadly around the world. After winning peace, populations vote for parties with deep roots in the violent organizations of the past. They do so in the aftermath of nearly every civil war, short wars, long wars, across a variety of political contexts, ethnic, non-ethnic, where they're peacekeepers, where there are no peacekeepers, in rich, poor countries, all regions of the world. For example, in Guatemala in 1999, the party of General Rios Montt, accused of genocide, won the elections. In El Salvador in 1994, the party most closely tied to the death squads, responsible with the armed forces of 95% of the wartime atrocities, won the election. In 2018 in Colombia, the party of President Álvaro Uribe, who is facing hundreds of ties to the paramilitary forces, and what Human Rights Watch called one of the worst episodes of mass atrocity in the Western Hemisphere, won the elections. And so understanding why is what inspired me to write the book. And when I started researching the book, as Allison knows well, because she was in the very early discussion, I thought that how violent the parties would determine their electoral success, and that the parties were most likely winning support not from their victims, but from non-victims. But I found that across all cases of civil war since 1970, the indiscriminately violent rebels and militaries did just as well in the elections as those that exercised restraint in their use of violence, and that terrorized regions were equally likely to vote for the belligerent parties as were regions unscathed by the wartime campaigns of violence. And that victims themselves were equally likely to vote for their perpetrators as for parties unstained by war. So then I thought, well, maybe this is a story of coercion, that people were voting with a gun to their head. But I found that these parties were equally winning free and fair democratic elections, and were winning the votes of those voting freely without fear. So I thought maybe there was a fog of war, that people were ignorant about the atrocities or didn't know whom the perpetrators were. But many of these elections came after truth commissions had reported on the nature of the atrocities. And so voters knew the facts of the violence. So why do people vote for bloodstained parties? In short, I find peace and security. I find that it doesn't matter how much violence the parties carried out, but rather what matters is the military outcomes of the war. So if war winning, bloodstained parties successfully campaign as the best providers of future societal peace. They counterintuitively sell themselves as the best protectors of voters. So what happens is that these violent victors are able to claim credit for peace. This credit for peace serves to offset or justify their use of violence. They manage to convince the population not to compare their use of violence in war to a world in which no violence took place, but instead to compare it to a world in which the violence continued. And relative to this bleak prospect, the population rewards the bloodstained parties with their votes for the relief of peace. But at the same time, these voters have very good reason to question whether the parties will re-victimize again in the future. So in order to win votes, they have to convince the population that they have both of James Madison's requisites of government, the strength to control the governed, which they clearly have because of their military victory, but also the restraint to control themselves. And they can employ a variety of tactics to convince the population of this. They moderate positionally. They also do so in their candidate choice. For example, the FRG party, guilty of the Mayan Holocaust in Guatemala, ran Rios Montt as the face of the party. He played the role of the old-fashioned caudillo on horseback, coming to save the nation. He's clad in army fatigues as the strong man. But then they paired him with leftist Portillo, who was a victim of the conflict, that could signal that the FRG wouldn't re-victimize the armed or unarmed left in the future. So desperate for peace, the population elects bloodstained parties to protect them. So if in American politics, it's about the economy, stupid, in context emerging from the anarchy of civil war, it's about security. And these elections of bloodstained parties have really important implications for peace, for democracy, for justice, and for social welfare. So against frequently cited fears, these post-war elections aren't necessarily destabilizing, leading to war recurrence. Instead, the strong military position of these violent victors deters their rivals from remilitarizing. So peace tends to consolidate. But in electing peace, the population tends to forego or at least postpone legal accountability and suffer degradation in their democracies and in social welfare. Obviously, electing actors guilty of crimes against humanity is not good for justice. And armed with political power, they tend to lock in their amnesties. But over time, as the power of the parties sometimes erodes, opportunities for justice can expand. The elections of bloodstained parties tends to sustain the democratic rules of the game as the parties sustain the system that got them into political power. But they tend to be bad for liberalism and for the deepening of democracy and to cause its backsliding. And finally, the population tends to gain in the area in which these parties have a comparative advantage and competency, and that's the security domain. But the population tends to suffer as these parties prioritize law and order over social and development expenditure. So we're going to sort of open it up and have an open conversation and Q&A. Jack will be moderating and making sure that we don't get completely off topic. So I think we can make it an open conversation.
So I wanted to start off by asking about the subjective state of the voters. So from what you've told us so far, it sounds like the voters are pretty self-aware, rational, forward-looking calculators. They're doing the math and they're maximizing their security gain. Does this go along with, however, any rationalization process, like stories they tell themselves or stories they tell to other people in their community about how they're justifying voting for the people who not only perpetrated atrocities, but in a number of cases perpetrated atrocities in their own community? Does just a rational story of it's for the good of our security in the future, is that enough in the victimized communities in particular, or are there more like rationalizations that they need to go through?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. And I think that the sort of the spinning of the past and the mitigating and the sort of disconnect between subjective violence and objective violence is sort of part of that they get to a rational point, but it is through more subjective violence. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, as I said, the facts of the violence don't necessarily align with how people attribute blame, and that war outcomes can cause for an asymmetric attribution of blame. So, for example, in the case of El Salvador, as I said, 95% of the atrocities were committed by the government side. And yet there are surveys that find that more people believe that the rebels have been more abusive of the population, which is not about them not knowing the facts of the violence. It's about whom must they blame for the violence. And so one part of it, and a lot of the book, the case studies, and especially in cases of military draw, is about trying to change voters' frames of reference, points of reference for the violence, such that, as I said, they compare it to a world in which the violence continued, not to a world in which it didn't take place in the first place. So there is some kind of processing of the violence that is not. I don't know if I would say it's rational or irrational, but it's not aligned with the facts of the violence. But then in terms of the rationalization, I think that there are different classes of voters. There are those who are not really paying attention. There are those who want to vote for these parties on security grounds, but need some kind of fig leaf to do so. And these kind of signals of restraint help for those voters. But then for the victims, and I think this is where you're really like, this is the more puzzling group of voters. I'm not arguing that all victims vote in this way. I'm arguing that they're equally likely to vote for the bloodstained parties as for parties unstained by war. So it's not that all victims vote in this way. I just find they're the most puzzling, and you wouldn't expect maybe any victim voters to vote in this way. And for those, that class of voters, these signals of restraint can be most important because they're the most worried about being re-victimized.
So I'm just going to ask one follow-up on this point. So most of our discussion so far is about how the voters see the contending parties, the protagonists, in their own story. But I want to ask about their general worldview. So, and what they say about that, if you have information on that point. So I remember reading a survey by like a US-based, survey company that had gone to like several conflict zones or post-conflict zones in the world and interviewed people about their beliefs on the laws of war that say you can't harm civilians in wartime and what they think about those laws. And they found that pretty much everywhere people said, oh yeah, those are great laws. They're totally for that, except they're completely irrelevant to our life here because we know that nobody's going to follow those rules. And so when we think about how we're going to behave, that just doesn't enter into it, even though we think it should. And so did you get people in the places you studied saying things like that, or having just kind of general kind of dog eat dog, and therefore you want the big dog to be on your side kind of worldviews?
Well, I think that in general, the book aligns more with an idea that justice is sort of a privilege that comes after security. And so the ability to want sort of these lofty normative ideas, the laws of war, that first they want stability, order, jobs. They want sort of the basic kind of human rights satisfied before they want to engage in some of the more normative or to seek justice. So I think that is part of it. I think that we find, I have a study right now where we have a conjoint experiment that kind of tests people's hypothetical preferences around transitional justice versus what happens in the real world. And sort of aligned with that in like just talking about like, do you like would punishment and apologies decrease your anger and your retributive preferences? And yes, like, and there are these norms of accountability, but when it comes to the actual experience of watching your perpetrator apologize or have punishment, we don't find the same thing. So I think that in the real world and in the messy reality on the ground, I think you don't find this kind of more lofty worldview and that you're sort of picking up on.
Okay. Thanks. Tom, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a little bit less surprised by the Mayan genocide case than other cases, because that could be simply the majority population not being upset that a minority population was attacked. You would hope that people would be upset when they weren't directly involved with something wrong happened in their neighborhood. But it's more puzzling the cases where their own neighborhood was victimized and they vote for the perpetrators, right? So I'm just trying to get a sense along Jack's question, the line of Jack's questions. Are they convinced that this former perpetrator group is going to be good at providing security because they're good at military stuff? Or is it that they're afraid that if they're not given power and they're on the outside, that they're going to go back to becoming perpetrators? Mm-hmm. So they're kind of just trying to satisfy it, mm-hmm. Give them what they want, because when they're on the outs, we all know what happens.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, in the areas of the Mayan genocide, granted, of course, you have the selection bias around survivorship and displacement, but those regions also voted for the FRG party, and the victims themselves voted for the FRG, and displaced voters voted in equal proportions for the FRG as non-displaced voters. So it's not just a
majority minority.
Right. Although we can talk about how this applies to ethnic conflicts, because most of the empirical focus of the book is on non-ethnic wars. So talking about sort of the observational equivalence with another story, which is more a fear of a return to violence. I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, with those people in mind. In other words, I want them to have power, because when they don't have power, they are violent. Mm-hmm. So just give them power, mm-hmm. and maybe they'll be less violent than when they're a rebel group. Because when they're a rebel group, they knock on my door at night and attack us. Mm-hmm. And if they're in power, maybe they won't. Yeah. That's one logic. And the other logic is these guys are really good at the use of force, and they'll be able to provide security once they're in power.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there is some observational equivalence, and I do like everything I can to try to parse out these two arguments, and to sort of, is it the perspective offering of security versus sort of more fear of what happens absent their electoral success. And so I try to figure out, first of all, I do lots of different things. So one, I try to see let's try to do a secret ballot versus an open ballot. And if their vote is more coerced, we might expect the results to be different. They're identical. I use open questions versus sort of closed questions, or sort of sensitive questions. And again, I find sort of equivalent results. They don't just win these votes without working really hard for them. They have to work really hard. They do all sorts of costly things that you wouldn't expect them to do if they could win on just their kind of coercive threat alone. So they do things such as purging their organization. They risk their core voters by moderating positionally. They try to expand their constituency. They target moderate voters. They do a lot to signal restraint. And you wouldn't have to do that if you were just coercive power. Also, the non-belligerent parties. So in the case of Guatemala, it's an especially puzzling case because there's a really strong non-belligerent party that was formed of technocrats and business people, completely unstained by war, in electoral incumbency. They were the government at the moment of the founding election. And so the population had a really good alternative of a party that had committed no atrocities. And I think if it were just a version of sort of strength and coercion, these parties would also win the core voters of the non-belligerent parties, who would also be scared. But they don't win those voters. They win their core voters. They win the swing voters, the valence voters, the non-ideological voters that are voting on security, and they win some of their victim voters. So I think that and then they also don't always win in the first round. They will do well in a first round. They'll do better than the other party, and ultimately they can win in a second round, but they would win in a first round too. Or in the case, just since I'm in the Guatemala mode, at the peak of, the PAN party won in 1995 when the conflict was still ongoing, when the threat of coercion was even higher. And so that also doesn't go along with the coercion story. So I think that there's evidence, and then all sorts of other evidence. There's evidence that the parties don't do better in regions in which there's more electoral manipulation. They don't do better in regions with null votes or blank votes. They do win these elections that are deemed free and fair. They don't win more. The government doesn't do better. Where there's government coercion, the rebels don't do better, where we have documentation of them using electoral coercion. So I can't rule it out. And I'm also not saying that there isn't all sorts of forms of electoral coercion after wars. And my first book is about how this is a very gray process as you go from war to peace, and that even sort of demilitarized environments are quite coercive, latently coercive. But I don't think it's just a story about fear.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. I guess I have a question about sort of like the role of legitimacy and whether these actors have legitimacy. I'm thinking like during the conflict itself, because sometimes, if actors are seen as legitimate, then violence is also seen as legitimate. And so whether that affects sort of how civilians view the violent act. So even if they're bloodstained, if they were considered to be legitimate, maybe they think that violence is legitimate. And if they were not legit, if they did not have legitimacy during the conflict, post-conflict, are we talking about is it just like a cost benefit rationale for voting? I guess in line with what Jack was saying. So it's kind of like they provide security and that's why we vote for them. Or do they also do these actors end up building legitimacy through displaying restraint and things like that? So that sort of helps them not whitewash, but kind of smooth over their black state past.
I think there is a lot of the legitimacy needing to sort of spin their violence, especially to the extent that they were the more indiscriminately violent actor in cases like Nicaragua is one of my cases because of the rebel victory there. And the Sandinistas were relatively restrained compared to some of the government. And so in that case, they have to do less to mitigate their violent past, but they still have to do some to convince the population of their security competence. Is it about legitimacy during the conflict? I think that the idea of legitimacy is all sort of wrapped up with popular support, and it's hard. It's sometimes hard to figure out how legitimate they are. I was concerned that popular support would be leading to war outcomes, and that it was sort of an omitted factor. But there's so much variation in war outcomes over the course of a conflict. So, for instance, in El Salvador, the rebels were very weak in the 1970s, the government very strong, but the rebels had a lot more popular support. And then in the 1980s, because of the US and USSR, there's a lot more parity in military outcomes. The rebels are still have a lot more legitimacy and popular support. They end at stalemate, and there's still, I think, in terms of the public perception, the population leaned left. They were fighting for redistribution and for an agenda that resonated with a majority poor, very unequal society. And so it took a lot for the government to be able to spin the past, and they didn't focus at all on positional politics, but instead focused only on valence and on that ideological platform. So I think that there's a lot of shift over time in war outcomes that can't be explained by just sort of underlying legitimacy. I think there's also some of the legitimacy comes from bringing security and bringing the relief of peace. And so there's kind of the causality might be going the other way. And a lot of times the parties that emerge victorious in war are not necessarily representative of the majority demographically or otherwise.
Can you say?
Oh, Elena?
It's not a tipping granite, so you are on the same question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking, when you say security, it is, what do you mean by that? Does it mean like people feel more confident in those people because first they have tried to represent that image, but they're trying to manipulate the population and then thinking like, okay, they might have been the good and they are the strong people to represent us? Or would this happen? Like when you say security?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Like when you say like people vote thinking that this party or like the people who have committed the crimes, they are voting for them because they assume they will bring security and stability. But when we think about it, is it like because they have been manipulated while voting to think that we are the strong people who will bring forward the country or who can support the country? Because I remember talking to one of my friends who was around these countries, and they kind of liked the dictator person because they thought it was strong. It was like a strong representative, smart, cunning, but like, it takes time people to understand. And until they understand, like the people in process become too powerful. Mm-hmm. So when you say security, like what does it mean?
Yeah. So yeah. So it's not. So are you sort of asking if the voters are kind of like not really understanding that they're being kind of like lemmings in kind of American politics, of like the elite are able to manipulate them. I don't really think that is what's going on, and that's again like they know the facts of the violence, but they are how they attribute blame is not aligned with it. And the parties do have to do all this work to cleanse their record. And why is that? Because their competence on security lies with their military record. And so, but their military record is also bloodstained. And so they have to transform the perception of their military record such that and launder it such that it's seen as a reputation for competence on prospective security. And so there are a bunch of different, it's not just their military record, it's also that they usually have stronger ties to the coercive apparatus. Their military record shows that, we use violence effectively to bring peace. We are able to we're willing to do anything necessary to bring about security, even if it means breaking the law in order to bring order. And it also lies with this sort of psychological symbolism of the strongman. There's like a psychological effect there that the American politics political behavior scholars have pointed to, like someone wearing a military uniform is seen as more competent on security. So it's for all those reasons that there is this perceived competence on security, but they have to do this laundering.
So I'm going to misunderstood the question, but even if I did, I answer the question as I understood it.
Yeah.
Which is it security is it their reputation for security in domestic affairs? Or is it that these people seem really strong and they'd be better representatives for the country abroad?
The former. But I think it's
I thought that's where you're going. Like security, is it domestic security or is it international security? And these guys are thugs, but there are thugs, and they're going to stand up to some party.
Yeah, I do think it's a really interesting future research question. I think that in general, there is this sort of connection between this book, which is about public opinion for the domestic use of force, and our literature on public opinion for the international use of force. And I think there are ways to combine those literatures and think about, is there a connection between being a violent victor and how people perceive that they will be in foreign policy? A lot of the countries I look at are not major world powers, but they are regional powers. And so there is the chance that they can be seen as more competent on international security as well.
So just to stick with this general point for one last question. I know that one thing that you did look at in the book is the media control advantages of the winners in the war. And you kind of weigh how much that affected the persuasiveness of the winners. So could you kind of share your bottom line on that?
So I think that the book is about why voters vote in this way, but it's also about how parties, this very big puzzle of like, what do I do with the fact that I have this, awful past, and how do I turn this liability into an asset? And so propagating the messages and how they are able to disseminate these messages is an important part of the story. And it seems to matter, especially in cases of military draws, where the parties have convergent electoral strategies about how to convince the population that they're what I call these restrained leviathans. And so in those contexts where they have convergent messages, who has the media advantage can end up being very significant. And there it seems to often lie with being in control of government. If you are a victor, then you often control the media, whether or not you are a government victor or a rebel victor, because where you're a rebel victor, you've usually taken over the state apparatus, and so you can control the media. But media advantage ends up being really important, and especially you see that in the case of El Salvador, where you have this military draw, but the electoral results end up being somewhat uneven, even though the two parties technically have the same claim to the security issue, because the government had a better ability to disseminate its message louder and louder.
What if I ask a question? It's on the topic of media and also addressing this process that you're talking about like repitching violence as something that's actually of utility to voters and utility to a post-conflict state. But when looking at the rhetoric used by parties kind of like involving in these campaigns, and looking at the rhetoric they might use media to project, what similarities do you see across different cases, and how do they actually go about pitching violence to the population? Do you see them using this language of security? Do you see them speaking about it in other ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a great question. Thank you. For the case studies, I analyzed thousands of ephemera from the Princeton Latin American archive, and also the archives in country of the parties. And so I look at a lot of their campaign messaging using natural language processing, but also analyzing them by hand. And what you find is both in how they sell themselves and how they undermine the other side. So they both try to sell themselves as the best providers of future security and undermining their rivals' ability to provide security. So the cases vary based on whether it's a draw or whether it's a victory. Where it's a draw, you usually have a strong rebel party and a strong government belligerent party. where it's, and depends on the electoral system, how many of these you have, where you have a asymmetric military outcome, you usually have a strong non-belligerent party and one strong belligerent party, and then a weaker losing party. And so the propaganda varies, but where you have a non-belligerent party and a belligerent party, the non-belligerent party will be arguing that they committed all these atrocities. They have bullets planned for the future, sort of really raising all of these issues of like they victimized and look at them. They're human rights abusers. They're going to re-victimize you in the future. We have to instead punish them. The belligerent parties are sort of doing this whole spin. Look, we brought you peace. We brought you order. We're going to bring you that in the future, and looking to Hobbes and saying, covenants and laws without the strength behind it is not likely to bring you much. They have the restraint to control the governed, but not the strength to control. The restraint to control themselves, but not the strength to control the governed. And so that's sort of the nature of the discourse, where you have a rebel party and a government belligerent party. It more centers on trying to throw say, you were much more violent than I was, and you're likely to be violent in the future. And so I have these amazing cartoons that the Arena party in El Salvador ran against the FMLN party. And again, I just sort of keep throwing out this statistic, but the government committed 95% of the violence. And yet all of these ads are, showing the rebel like on top of a rubble, like this is how many schools were destroyed during the war. This is how many mayors that were assassinated. This is how many, like every single type of violence, not taking it, not accepting any responsibility that they had, and sort of showing the FMLN committed all of this violence. Are they likely to be good for the children in the future? Are they likely to build schools in the future? Are they likely to bring anything perspective in terms of order and recovery in the future? So that's sort of the nature of the difference.
Elena.
I have a question on like when these parties are running and they're willing to like make concessions, like in terms of like purging like certain units maybe from their political apparatus or whatever. Like who's running that for them, and like what are they like not willing to trade on, and like what is kind of like what's the space for reform like within these types of outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what? So there is variation, and but they tend to not be willing to give up their strong man if they're the victors. So the electoral strategy for the losers is different. They should purge and only run civilians because they're trying to run on what I call a tactical and moderate platform, where they want to show commitment to the democratic rules, and so it looks different. And they have the hardest time doing so because they usually don't have a pool of party recruits that's deep enough to fully purge, and it's very hard to decapitate themselves. So the leaders don't usually want to self-decapitate, and so they don't end up always running on the sort of optimal electoral strategy, which hurts them electorally. For the winners, they tend to not be willing to sacrifice their strongmen, but they'll pair it with a restraint or a clean civilian. So you see this across all the cases, like as I said, Rios London, Portillo, in El Salvador, you have the sort of father of the death squads, like someone that the U.S. called a pathological killer, and then they pair him with Calderon, who's was a very sort of clean type of could signal that it would be a restrainer. And they have these great lines that say, Dabusan is giving his power to Calderon. Or Uribe had his reputation was so tarnished by the ties to the paramilitaries but then he ran Duque, who is like a completely clean technocrat. So you have this sort of pairing, and then they tend to hide in closed lists or in safe districts. They're kind of human rights abusers, and in competitive districts in presidential elections, they'll run the cleaner civilians that can signal the restraint.
What about like when they have times like when it's like the one that's in government, like was on the side of the state that's winning? Like,
say that again.
Like when it's like the belligerent that was also the government at the time of the war, like, do they ever purge their like bureaucracies that were used to commit these abuses, or is it like, because like, I guess I'm kind of curious also about like the institutionalization of violence, like in a lot of these countries in the long term, and like whether it's ever like a competitive enough election that we're like going to meaningfully reform our police as a way of like transitioning to peace, or does that just like never happen?
No, it does happen. I mean, and I think, well, Deborah Yashar's amazing work on Central America suggests that it definitely didn't go far enough in terms of the security sector reform, and therefore you had a lot of homicidal violence after. But in the case of El Salvador, for example, the President Cristiani was faced with a list of 100 people to purge from the armed forces, and he purged them and let all the generals' heads roll. And the military felt that they were sold out. And so you do that one even further than I would have anticipated. But you do see that kind of reform to fully break ties with the old party and signal that the party won't restrain. And that was, I think, where you have the military draw and you have both sides able to point to the other side. I think that Arana had to go a lot further because history was not on its side.
Yes, please. Since I lived in Colombia during middle school and also during the freshman year of high school during the election 2018, and I saw firsthand, at least in my limited experience, that a lot of the association that they had with the left and FARC and the ELN or the M19, like Papa Petro, the current now president, is that they were Marxist, and implicit in every conversation I had with them is that they were atheists, that they didn't like religion. And as a result, because Colombia is quite a conservative society, a Catholic society, they kind of had an advantage already on top of the security bona fides that Uribe and his party had already. And since we are mostly talking about Latin America, like Chile, Salvador, Guatemala, which tends to be more Catholic and thus a little bit more conservative, do you think religion plays a role or helps the security party already, especially if the opponent is a Marxist or Maoist or any other type of left-wing group? Because in Colombia, at least, it definitely seemed like it was a big factor running against Petro, and that he really had to remove himself from in the election last year in order to win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I'm not arguing that security is the only thing that matters to voters. It matters. I am arguing against the American politics literature that assumes that it's only economics, and economics do matter in these contexts, but war tends to decimate economies. There aren't really any good retrospective votes to run on. And I think that most of our literature comes from developed democracies that haven't experienced widespread insecurity from war or crime or repression. And so we sort of don't pay enough attention to security. But security matters. I think it's 54% of the population on average across all countries around the world for which there is data around the time of the founding elections. But that means a lot of other issues matter too. And there are people have ideological attachments and commitments, and sometimes those stem from their right-left orientation, might be around religion. That said, in Colombia, obviously, Petro is able to just win. And so you can't say that it has, that was determinant of what happened. And I argue in the book, I look at the FARC in 2018 and that they adopted a sort of non-optimal, non-equilibrium strategy of not mitigating their past, not being contrite for their past, given that they were the militarily weaker at the end of the war, that they didn't moderate positionally, that they only ran their most human rights abusing candidates. Whereas Petro, not that he is, has this combatant history, but then he was a civilian for much longer, mayor of Bogotá. So you can't really say that he is he's not exactly a belligerent party, but he did exactly what the book would suggest is what parties that have ended the war in a weaker position should do, which is tactical and moderation. So to be contrite for your military past, to have sort of a civilian and show your commitment to democratic politics and run as an immoderate versus a radical.
In terms of blame, is there some kind of a bias for blaming the rebels just on the grounds that, well, wait, they're not the government, they're the rebels. Being a rebel is just a bad thing. Like holding constant everything else, just being a rebel, you got a lot to explain. Did you get that sense?
So I treat rebels and governments as symmetrical to each other, partially because when rebels become, if they win, they basically become the government. And rebel victors, not that they govern the same, but I find that they pursue the same, have to pursue the same electoral strategies to be elected, and that war outcomes can explain what happens to rebels in the exact same way that it explains what happens to governments. And we see this like the Sandinistas, like Somoza is the incumbent and the Sandinistas are the rebels. 1979, all of a sudden they're reversed. The Sandinistas are the government, the Somozas are the rebels, and then they're the Contra rebels. And then things kind of switch again in 1990, and you have the sort of remilitarization of the Sandinistas even after 1990. So I think that it's a little bit confusing sometimes to how we think about governments and rebels as a result. That said, I do think because of the media advantage of the government, they have an amazing propaganda machine that operates during war to delegitimize rebels in the way that you are discussing. And unless rebels come out, have completely managed to win, I think that there is some of what you're talking about.
And in a similar way, what about being tagged as a criminal? Whether you're in the government or you're a rebel, if people come to believe that you are a criminal or your organization is basically a criminal organization rather than a political party, is that an inference that matters, or is that also something that is like a third order concern as to who will be, bringing the peace through competent rule?
Well, that sort of goes back to the discourse, and a lot of these cartoons are like are FMLN like operating, being shown as a bandit and a criminal, and like, oh, like we'll provide security. We have the means to do so, and they're like all criminals. They're like, we can't purge our organization of the criminals. We wouldn't have anybody left. Like all sorts of sort of cartoons like that. And I think that undermining the other side's competence on security is often calling them criminal and using sort of we either use the war on terror or the war on crime to they use this to their advantage, calling the other side criminals or terrorists.
Allison.
I really enjoy this project, as you know, and find it very insightful, and so much so that Holly and I were discussing it the other day and trying to apply it to Afghanistan. And you might just say, like, this is way outside the scope of my project. Talk about it later. But we're sort of wondering, like, why would you say the Taliban don't just hold elections and run on being the people who can provide security, the strongmen, and then like win and then have a bunch more legitimacy? And why don't they just do that? Or what would your theory expect them to do that? And like I said, maybe it's outside of the scope of what we were stumped.
That is a very good question. Maybe they will. Maybe they still will. It's very rare to not hold elections, as Jack knows from his data set as well on post-war elections. Post-war elections are held in almost every case of civil wars. Not that I wouldn't expect them to necessarily have democratic elections, and the post-war elections do vary in how democratic they are. I focus on the more puzzling cases, which are the democratic one. The problem is that maybe they would hold elections, which is very common, would legitimate the rule to a certain extent, like would get more international legitimacy. The challenge is, would we ever be able to really know the citizens' preferences? It's the same like in Syria. If Assad were to have elections, I think he would probably win those elections, maybe for ending the war, even though the popular support is maybe the underlying popular support is not there. But I think that there is a desire or an understanding that tragically, this is like tragically that they are probably the best, like most likely to keep security going forward. But it is outside of I don't know. That's all personally, all thinking through it. And I would love to continue to think through this.
I'm interested in the temporality of your arguments and of your findings, so do you find, for instance, that the length of the civil war has an impact, on the likelihood of success of the belligerent parties or the level of success that they would reach, And in the same way, do you find that they tend to get re-elected, 4 or 5, I don't know how many years, down the line once the kind of trauma, of just finishing war, civil war, is a bit more kind of past, how do you see it kind of evolving, these preferences and these kind of voters' behaviors, over time? I don't know if you have any arguments on that.
Those are great questions. The project has the most to say about context where the violence is widespread. There are many people affected by the conflict, and so security is highly salient. And that might not be the case if you have a very short war. It's also not necessarily the case where I argue that there are limits, like explaining the case of like Northern Ireland is not likely to explain national elections in the UK. Violence in Mindanao might not explain the national elections in Luzon. Bangladesh is not going to influence elections in Pakistan, like at the time of independence. So that those types of secessionist conflicts where violence is geographically delimited might not affect national elections. Similarly, a very short war might not lead to the type of conflict affectation that is part of the argument, or a scope condition for the argument. In terms of what happens over time, there is a very strong correlation of 0.7 between the first election, post-war election, and the second post-war election. And so the parties do tend to lock in their power. That said, there's variation in how salient security remains over time. And so your question does go beyond the scope of the book, but the book does talk about like what it doesn't research it in depth, but it talks about what it thinks might happen, which is that over time, these parties have to run on other issues as citizens' concerns become multivalent, and that they often have to build up party machines and to be able to turn to clientelism and patronage in order to do well in politics over time. And that there's variation in parties' ability to do that, which merits future research. But that said, in other times where security becomes salient again because there is remilitarization or because there's a spike in crime or terror or other types of crime, the parties can again point to their competence on these issues. And so we see, for example, in El Salvador in 2019, years after the Civil War that ended in 1992, Arena saying, "Look, we brought you peace. We'll be able to bring you security in the future." I mean, it's like in their tweets. So it's sort of amazing. The security brand can remain dormant, and other entrepreneurs will try to use it, or the parties themselves will try to use it. So we see all sorts of actors trying to capitalize on the security brand, from like Fujimori's daughter in Peru to Trujillo's grandson in the DR, to Marcos in the Philippines, to Buhari running on his draconian war in the 1980s to say that he can fight Islamist terrorists. Like there's lots of cases of sort of trying to run on the security brand at other points in time.
So sticking with this question of the long run consequences of the voters' choice in the post-war election, one of our Columbia PhDs, Paola Cesarini, a while back, a couple of decades ago, wrote a dissertation on comparing Italian and Portuguese transitional justice accountability when the abusive dictatorship fell. And so in Italy, the end of World War II, Cold War context, the U.S. was like happy with any conservative government that was going to keep order. And so there was very little, if any, accountability of the systematic legal nature going on for the crimes of the fascist regime. And in fact, later on, we see the Italians voting for Berlusconi, voting for far-right parties, now voting for a formerly fascist party. And Paola's argument is that's because they didn't construct a narrative of what actually happened under fascism. It was just swept under the rug. Whereas in Portugal, of course, transitioned much later into the 70s, the Salazar regime collapses, Portugal democratizes, and as a very purposeful project, they construct a transitional justice narrative, not just holding some trials, but actually rewriting Portuguese history so that people would understand what that regime was actually up to. Mm-hmm. And, her argument is that Portugal has been, a much more stable democracy, rule of law place, much more progressive politics than Italy on average. And it's because they faced the issue like from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And, are your rational security voters maybe like overweighting immediate security in a way that's like, maybe not so rational with broader perspective?
Yeah. So, I think your work really helps us understand that justice can be constrained by power politics, and that there are limits to what might be possible in terms of accountability because of the nature of the perpetrator's power. So, and in those contexts of one-sided violence, where it's just the government and it's not a war, we know that it depends on the nature of the democratic transition if transitional justice is possible, like Argentina and Chile. And even in Argentina, like quickly they revoked the amnesty. They tried to do trials, but then they quickly went to the amnesty law. So are they being sort of not thinking about these longer term dynamics? And ultimately, I really believe that it's up to voters to decide these trade-offs, because there are trade-offs, and I don't want to sort of impose a normative opinion that they should be doing something that is not. It's up to them to sort of decide between justice and peace and security. And I'm sort of telling the story of how they're deciding. And I think that in the short term, there is this sort of offsetting of their violence with this provision of security. But over time, I think that the reference points change, and voters begin to compare the world of violence not to a world in which the violence continued, but to a world in which the violence never happened, and therefore become more retributive over time. and seek transitional justice more over time. And we see that in many contexts too, from Guatemala, where the power wanes and security sort of becomes more stabilized, although crime is out of control, but the security of the civil war becomes more consolidated. You see a genocide trial begin. You see Fujimori trial. You see the narrative even in El Salvador, the very strong narrative that the rebels were responsible for the violence. You see some of the rewriting of history over time. And so I think there are prospects for justice over time. But I think that the nature of the transition limits that, and voters ultimately make these decisions. But ideally, we would have peace and justice. But as you've told us,
yes. Well, it's true. That is the side of the argument. Olivia, do we have questions from the Zoomers?
Yeah, and you've spoken to this a little bit, but Juan Corredor asks, wondering if you've considered other variables beyond security provision that violent victors use in their repertoires to win elections. For example, political communication campaigns, which we kind of talked about, legacies of political violence, and the like.
Yes, so it's not just about the war outcomes, it's also about their political strategies. And so that is their strategies around programs they put out, their ideological positions. So I argue that they have to moderate, because you often have non-belligerent parties that can control the centrist, or are more credible with the centrist voters. So they moderate positionally to say, look, we're the same on position, so let's focus on valence. And we're better on the security valence issue, but they tend to downplay position because they don't have as much credibility on it. About the candidate choice, about who they target electorally, like they have usually more immoderate, hardcore constituents, and they need to sort of create all sorts of new, broader electorate constituencies that they will usually appeal to nationalism rather than, that were right, far right or far left, or in ethnic contexts like Rwanda. You see them all of a sudden saying like Rwanda nationalism instead of Hutu Tutsi. And so they're sort of trying to create new overarching electoral constituencies. So there's a lot more of strategy that they have to do beyond just looking to their war outcome.
Why do they, like you said, they usually hold elections, but why do they hold elections? Like, if they have the power, are they not scared to lose it? Because like they are the bad people. Why are they not scared to hold the elections? Why do? And it's the most common thing. Why do, like, psychologically, I would just, if you really wanted the power, you have the power. Mm-hmm. Why do you want to, like, go into an option where you might lose?
So I think this gets to the sort of really strong international norm of holding elections after a war now. And maybe it's more about how involved, and this goes back to Alice's question about Afghanistan. And even if the UN is not involved in some of the conflicts that I study as in others, and definitely not as much as in the African context or elsewhere, there is this very strong international norm to hold elections, and indeed they are held in most. So, but it's to legitimate their power, to legitimate them internationally, and it seems that they run because I think there is this concern that maybe they won't end their war because they won't do well in elections. But you see lots of parties running that don't end up doing very well in the election. Where you do have, there's a story here, which is where you have a change in the balance of power after the war and before the elections, and where the electoral outcomes become misaligned with military outcomes. You do see a return to violence in those cases. And so sometimes military and electoral outcomes will be misaligned because people use a strong heuristic of the war outcome to choose their vote. And so they don't always update on changes to the balance of power. And so in that context, you have misalignment. But in general, they have elections because the electoral results often reflect the military.
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Maybe just a very short one. Most of your cases seem to have a binary, option where it's either, government or rebel. But do you have cases that you've studied as well that have like a third party or even like a third force? I mean, it's like a political kind of spectrum, and in those cases where you're not in a binary, what happens, and do you see any kind of shifts in people's positioning if they're presented with more options than just these two main ones?
So I try to make it parsimonious in the argument to say that there is a winning or stalemated belligerent, a losing belligerent, and a non-belligerent. And that's sort of how the theoretical framework is set up. But the electoral rules will determine how many parties there are, as we've known for a long time. And so you might get multiple parties in each of these categories. Colombia, as you likely know, is a lot messier than I stated. And so there it's actually really interesting because I can look at if they choose sort of the electoral equilibrium strategy or not. So, and that was the story I have told about like the FARC and Petro as like a sort of weird party. But you also have Uribismo and Santismo, like two actors that sort of came out of the government belligerent side, or you could sort of attribute blame for the false positive and a lot of the government human rights abuses. And you see Uribismo chooses an optimal electoral strategy, whereas Santismo doesn't. And so you're able to look at sort of the electoral ramifications of that. And in a lot of contexts, there are multiple, in most contexts, there are multiple parties. Some of them can be smaller or larger, depending on the war outcome and the electoral system.
Kind of like a follow-up to what was the before about Santismo. Like, do you think you could apply your theory in the book to like a potential plebiscite, like the one Colombia had, over whether to make peace or not? Do you think that could affect whether people want the peace or whether they're willing to accept it? I know that Colombia is a very specific case, but if something like that were to happen again in another country like Syria, or as unlikely as it would be, do you think it could affect the likelihood of people wanting peace and security? Or do you think it could move them, like in Colombia, to get time to reject the peace agreement and to favor a little more hostility from the government's part against the rebels?
That's an interesting question. So it is complicated because it wasn't that people didn't want peace; they didn't want those peace terms. And they didn't want, and that is part of the equilibrium strategy that Santismo ran on. Like, we basically are at a military draw with the rebels, whereas Uribismo ran as, we have militarily defeated the rebels, and that we brought peace and security, and they did sort of the whole mitigation rhetoric, whereas Santismo was like, I'm so sorry for any atrocities that the government has committed, which is not equilibrium when you have ended the conflict at an advantage, as the Colombian government did, even though the rebels were not defeated. And so I think I see the plebiscite as and the Santismo strategy there all around. I mean, they ran the guy who was like wonderful man, but he didn't really have the security competence. Whereas even though Duque was just sort of the face of the party, but everyone knew that Uribismo was behind it, and he was more of the caudillo type strongman figure. And so you see it kind of across the board, the variation in their strategies there.
Okay, so we always tell our students for their term papers, start with a really good puzzle. And boy, did you start with a great puzzle and came up with a great answer. So thanks for sharing that with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Jack, and thank you all for coming, and thank you all who are online for engaging with